All right. Here's a good question. What in the world is the integration of faith and learning? And why in the world do we care about it? And that is the question that I would like to answer in this next lecture. My hope is that you'll walk out of here with a very clear vision both of what integration is, but also of why it might be important, and important particularly for Christian universities to know and practice well. If you were to look at, does that make a difference? Okay. If you were to look at most Christian colleges, you would find that they are committed to the integration of faith and learning verbally. You would find it in their written material. Biola certainly would number among them. You usually find it on their websites, it's in their catalogs, it'll be in their curriculums. It'll be affirmed by administrators. I've noticed Dr. Corey almost in every convocation, every time he makes mention of the mission statement of Biola, will talk about things either by literally directly about integration of faith and learning or something that is just that same concept under different terms. So it's very ubiquitous here. But if you were to ask a student on one of our campuses, what is the integration of faith and learning, what would they actually say? Now, the interesting thing is you don't have to wonder. We did this here at Biola. And I hopefully, let me see if my little video, I have a new computer, and it may or may not actually be able to find this video. We'll see what happens. Oh, wait a minute. I should plug in. Yeah. For the sake of time, actually, I won't show this clip. It's fun, it's funny, it's cute. It doesn't really tell you anything. But you have a bunch of students going, integration, that's where like you feel kind of like apart from everybody, but then you get together with everybody, and then after a while, you feel like you belong with everybody. That's integration. And there's like 3 or 4 minutes of student clips rambling in these various directions. And I just keep that video around for like job security, in case people are wondering if we have a need, there it is. Probably more importantly and really more directly to the point, when I first came to Biola and began talking to people about the integration of faith and learning to figure out exactly where we were, I decided I would baptize the current operating model of integration as the Book of Judges model of integration, in which everyone does what is right in their own eyes. Now, the good news about the Biola version of this at that time is that people weren't doing bad things. In that sense, it was unlike the Book of Judges, because in the Book of Judges, they do really bad things by their own eyes. At Biola, there was a lot of good things going on, but it was operating under a very interesting different set of paradigms of what people thought the target of integration of faith and learning should be. And they were all good things. No one was shooting at something bad, but they were interestingly different things. And if I were to summarize the 3 models I have bumped into most commonly here, they would be the following. And number 1 is what you might call the ministry model for the integration of faith and learning. And the idea here is that the integration of faith and learning means taking things associated with the Christian faith and integrating it into all the rest of Christian life. So for example, you will have people doing marketplace ministry kinds of things. And the idea there is to say, okay, you businessmen, we'll get you together at noon down in downtown LA, and we will have a meeting at which a person will speak from the word and people will come to Christ. And so notice what you're doing is taking the exact kind of thing you would normally be doing in church on a Sunday morning from 10 to 11, lifting it up as a package and dropping it into a business place Thursday at noon in downtown LA. But what Christian ministry is, what integration is always the churchy-like things just brought into every other non-churchy aspect of the culture. And that's what we're thinking when we're thinking integration. So it means sharing your faith at the workplace, leading Bible studies at the workplace, praying perhaps at the workplace, all those sorts of things. Now, I was a pastor for 20 years. Do you think I'm opposed to that? I mean, I think that's great. My only question is that really the integration of faith and learning? Is that what we mean by that? Another tweak of this same ministry model is represented by this webpage, and my guess is because the print is so small and a little bit out of focus, you probably can't read it. But it's a workplace ministry website. That's the name of this organization. And they state here their goal for what it is they want to accomplish. And the first thing they say, business people gain a fresh insight and revelation as to what they were called to do within the body of Christ, what they're called to do in the marketplace, what they're called to do in the church. So, first that is give a vision to these business people. But the question is, so what's their vision? What is it they're supposed to be doing? I'm glad you asked. Here it is. That pastors' visions would be funded. That buses will be bought for children's ministry. That churches and their missionaries will be supported and funded at a huge level. That churches will be built, that billions of dollars will be redeemed for kingdom use. Now that's interesting. Again, I confess I was a pastor. The idea of having businessmen give to the church, I actually was in favor of. So let's get that part straight. I'm not opposed to this. I'm just saying, what message are you sending when you're saying we want to get a new vision for business people of where they belong in the body of Christ, and where they belong in the body of Christ is funding the pastor's vision. So what is it that you're saying about the Christian life and the Christian vision for the world in which we live? It is a strictly spiritual, Bible, churchy kind of vision. Jesus has an idea for what to do with a church, but he probably has no idea for what to do with a marketplace, with a city plan, with an economic problem, or anything else like that. The Bible doesn't really apply over there. And the way you make something spiritual is by attaching it somehow to the classic church thing. So the way you do integration in both of these models I've described is basically take the 10 to 11 o'clock Sunday morning vision of Christian life as lived in church and smear it out over 24/7, 365. And the Christian thing is always the churchy thing, so to speak, in this vision. Now, as I've already said, I have no problem with people being faithful to share their faith, give their money, do all these things in every time and place. That is not at all what I'm opposed to. But I am asking a question, is that the vision we have for what the integration of faith and learning really is? That's one model. I've seen it here at Biola. I've seen it here a lot. And I imagine you've bumped into this sometimes in your classrooms, as both from students and probably other professors. So one model is this ministry model. A second model is what I will call the cultural critique model for what it means for us to be integrating our faith and learning. And in this case, what people say is, oh no, the gospel indeed has implications for how we worship, but it also may have implications for how we work and how we live in human culture. And indeed, what we need to do is to bring a gospel-shaped critique to bear on the activities of the culture of this world. And so you will have people doing, theologies of culture and things like that, criticisms of culture, pointing out where, for example, Hollywood is doing things wrong or things of that nature. Another big area in which we have done this has been a political critique. And so the website I have here is from the Family Research Council, and that is an evangelical political action group. And it kind of spun out of Focus on the Family. They're an independent group now, but that's where their roots were. And just as an example of this, I love this headline I happened to capture when I did this clip. It says, "Stop Obama's Cross-Dresser Protection Bill." Now, here's my suspicion. I haven't checked, I admit it. But my suspicion is if I were to check, I would discover that Obama didn't actually name this the Cross-Dresser Protection Bill. There's probably some other agenda he had, and some entailment of this bill would no doubt protect a cross-dresser. But you can see the critique mindset, the you're doing it wrong sort of a mindset that is being played out here. And here's one of my worries about that. And again, just like I said before with the ministry model, the good part of it, you know, we need to do ministry in all those places. Likewise with the critique, if there was ever a culture who could stand a critique, modern American culture has got to be right up there on the list. So I have no problem critiquing our culture. But I do have a problem with our vision for the Christian faith being one of critique. And here's my worry. It's a little bit like we become the grand referees of culture, and I don't think that's a compelling vision for us. Let me just ask a quick question. How many of you guys participated in either high school or college sports? Have done that actively? Okay, who's at Biola? Anybody doing sports at Biola? What sport? Track. What do you do in track? Sprints. Okay, and that isn't such a, anybody doing a game kind of sport, volleyball, basketball, baseball? You'll understand, I'm not anti-track. You'll understand why I say that in a minute. Softball, there's a good example. So, you have a softball coach, right? Okay, so at the beginning of your softball season, is softball spring sport? Softball's like year round, right? You guys are always playing softball. But anyhow, spring sport. Beginning of the spring, your coach, I assume, sits down and goes through the softball rule book with you guys, right? And you have kind of like a quiz session and studies, and you have study groups working on the well, doesn't she sometime like review the whole softball rule book? Did she buy you guys all a softball rule book? What are we paying these people for? What did she do then?
She critiques us and helps us on our skills.
Oh, she helps you play the game, not know the rules. Doesn't she care about the rules? What if you run from first to third to second to home?
Then we'd have some
Problematic, right. But part of the operating assumption is that you kind of know the rules, and now the key thing is the strategy for playing the game effectively. And coaches care enormously about how you play the game. And part of that is indeed the boundary conditions. They do care about the rules, and if you break the rules, you get in trouble. Why? Well, because you lose the game. But they are game focused. Now, how many of you guys who have played sports have had your life significantly impacted by a coach? They made a significant impact on your life. Okay. How many of you guys had your life significantly impacted by a referee? How many of you guys ever been to the Referees Hall of Fame, which is located in, where is it located? Oh yeah, there is no Referees Hall of Fame. We don't like referees, right? Coaches we like, playing we like, but there's something about the guy who lives with a little stripy shirt on and a dumb whistle in his mouth, and every time you turn around, toot, toot, foul on you, that you just get tired of it. Swallow the whistle, take off that silly striped jersey, and shut up and sit down and let us play, right? Do you realize how tired our culture gets of Christians when all we are the referees of culture? When every time they hear us raise our voice, what they hear us say is toot, toot, foul on you. And we don't play the game. We don't get out there and make a good movie. We just criticize a bad one. We don't write a good version of Harry Potter. We just complain about a bad version of it because they have witches and warlocks and creepy things in these things. We do the refereeing, critiquing job. And you know what you end up with is a mindset about what the Christian faith is highly legalistic and referee-esque. And there is no surprise, given that fact, that the culture doesn't appreciate the Christian contribution so very deeply. And notice even as you were saying that your coach does critique you guys, right? Coaches are known for critiquing you. But you realize when they're critiquing from the standpoint of a constructive help to play the game better. And you know the coach knows how to play the game. The coach is an experienced player, more experienced than you. You know you have something to learn from them. And the suspicion our culture has when they look at Christians and say, you guys don't make movies, you don't dance, you don't write books, you don't do these other things, and then you turn around and critique us, why in the world do you think we would learn from you guys? A friend of mine's dad started a very large building construction company down in San Diego. It's been active for 40 years, and it's a very, very big company, very successful. He has this nice little saying: those who can build, those who can't inspect. And you can just see this guy who's been building buildings for 53 years all over Southern California, and you get this 29-year-old building inspector showing up and saying, well, your rivets are too far apart. He's like, can I strangle that little pencil neck of yours? That mindset of inspector is one that you want to be really, really cautious in how you exercise, and exercise it with a clear vision to making a difference in the thing you're actually doing. So this is my worry with the cultural critique model. It is not that the culture needs no critique, but rather that the critique of the culture needs to be directed at the vision for what the culture ought to be. So that's where we get to the third model, which is what I will call the cultural participation model. And here you're saying, here's the entailment of my Christian faith. Because I'm a Christian, I need to participate in and live in human culture well. I need to be a participant in human culture, but a Christ-like participant in it. I need to produce cultural goods, not just critique the cultural goods that someone else has produced. The website I use for this is a shameless piece of self-advertisement. You'll notice a familiar face right there. But this is theologylived.com. And this is a resource that we are building at Biola, really geared largely to faculty, but it's wide open to anybody, of resources about the integration of faith and learning that is built largely on this cultural participation model. And I point this out because we do a whole bunch of things called table talk that we will film faculty members presenting on these issues, and you may find some good resources for some of the projects and things you do, even in this kind of a setting, and we are building it on an ongoing basis. Now, as I say, shameless self-promotion, and the point is not that I came up with this website. That is not really what I care about at all. I would like to argue that this is actually a very long tradition of the Christian faith of being active in producing what you might call human flourishing, making human life work, producing durable Christian goods. And so I just spun out a batch of examples of this from hundreds I could have chosen, but these are ones that for one reason or another happen to stick in my mind. Boyle's Law. Anybody here chemistry major? Science major? Yeah, a little thin. Anybody know Boyle's Law? Probably had it did you have high school chemistry? Gas laws, PV equals nRT. Does that ring any bells? There's a bell. Yeah, okay, good. So Robert Boyle was an English scientist in the, I think, probably early 1600s, maybe late 1500s, the beginning of Enlightenment science. And he was an evangelical Christian and a flaming apologist for the Christian faith. And he had this very deep commitment to the notion that God has created the world in an ordered fashion, and he has created our minds such that we can see and perceive that order. Therefore, we should read and understand his world the same way we read and understand his word. And if you want to read and understand the word, you need to learn the languages of the original scriptures, so Greek and Hebrew. And if you want to read and understand science, you need to figure out, in effect, the laws of nature. One of those laws being Boyle's Law. And so, born of his evangelical convictions about God, he's looking at a world that is expecting to be designed, ordered, and knowable by a human being. And in the course of this kind of study, he discovers, the gas laws, Boyle's Law, and it's a thing that's actually proven very potent over the course of 400 years in terms of the fruit of it. In a similar vein, calculus, product of Isaac Newton and Leibniz, kind of at the same time, both came up with it. But that analogy I gave you in terms of the laws of nature, what laws did God write into it? The other thing that there was the language of nature. And this is where Newton basically said, you know what the language of nature is? Directly analogous to Greek and Hebrew in which the Bible was written, the language of nature is calculus and mathematics. The ability of mathematics to describe nature is an absolutely phenomenal thing. We take it for granted because we've been taught that since we were taught math. We did word problems describing if you shoot a rifle at a 45-degree angle with a muzzle velocity of 88 meters per second, how far will it land, how high will it go? You do all those calculations, and guess what? That mathematic description will accurately describe the trajectory, the distance, the height of that bullet that you've shot. With Newton, it was describing the motion of the planets, which had been kind of deeply mysterious up to this point. And he's saying, look, they're basically following with Newton and then modified with Kepler. You realize that it's actually an elliptical orbit, not a circular one, but you predict the motion of the planets based on mathematical calculations. You determine acceleration and things like that based on math. And if you've ever had the experience of taking high school physics or something like that, where you do acceleration problems with these really complicated algebraic equations, square roots of things squared and added together and all this kind of riffraff, it was always a mess. I remember that in high school and just, painful. When you do that in calculus, it is the simplest expressions you could possibly imagine. It isn't, something squared here and there. It's like, well, the change in location relative to time, ds over dt. That's velocity, because that's just what it means for something to move, is a change in location over time. And if you change how fast it changes over time, that's a change in the change of location over time. So it's a second derivative or an integral if you're going backwards in this process. But you don't have to memorize a single formula to do all those incredibly complicated calculations you did in high school. Once you know calculus, you don't have to memorize a darn thing. I had this experience. I was a chemistry major as an undergraduate, and I took calculus from a very painful calculus teacher. My first college exam, memorable experience. I got a 28. Now, I'd had calculus in high school, so I was kind of like in second semester. I'd had like a whole year of calculus, but they gave me one semester placement. But I was doing things that I kind of had in high school. So I'm thinking, hey, this should be no big deal. I show up, I get a 28 on this exam. Professor walks in, says, okay, hands out the exam. Class average on this exam was a 22. So I did feel good. I beat the class average, but not very good. And she said, that's the first thing you need to know. Second thing you know is I don't grade on a curve. Third thing you need to know is I will give one makeup exam, and it will be for this exam, and it'll be next Wednesday. That was the end of her discussion about the exam. She turns around and just gets on with whatever's coming next in class. And this is my first college exam. Give me a break. Where's the deep end of the pool here so I can just jump in and kill myself now? So I go home, I study my brains out for this thing, and I managed to get an 80 on the makeup exam. I have never been so happy at a flaming B- in my life as I was that day. And that was that whole calculus class. So at the end of that semester, they had a university. I went to Colorado State University, so there's 20,000 people there. So they had a university-wide final exam for calculus. So everybody gets the same exam. Our class got the highest average grade on the final exams, and we had the lowest grades for the semester grade. How do I feel about that? Well, pretty interestingly, I am so glad I learned calculus, because then I took physics, and I didn't have to memorize a single equation, because you know what? I understood calculus. And that's the language in which these things are written. Where is this kind of design and investigation coming from? Newton, just like Boyle, was a person captured by the idea that this is designed by God. Newton wrote as much biblical commentary as he did science. I should point out his biblical commentary is not nearly as good. So if you've never read any of his commentaries on like a Revelation or something, trust me, not a big loss, but he did write a lot of things about the Bible. He was very much captivated by that kind of a vision. Sistine Chapel, one of the great works of art, not only of the Western world, I think by any standard that human beings have ever produced. And what is the entire vision that the Sistine Chapel is expressing? Well, it's the vision of the entire biblical narrative is really being laid large there. Lord of the Rings. Ralph Wood is a professor down at Baylor, and I'm pretty sure it was he who said this. He calls The Lord of the Rings the book of the century, of the 20th century. Now, I like Frodo, I confess, but isn't book of the century? The 20th century, we did a lot of things in the 20th century. Einstein did do the theory of relativity in the 20th century. I mean, Frodo, Lord of the Rings, is the greatest book of the 20th century. Here's his argument. He says, walk into any bookstore in the country, and you will find the largest section of that entire bookstore is the fantasy and sci-fi literature section. And you know who basically single-handedly created that entire genre is J.R.R. Tolkien. And if you want to give a little help to the other Inklings, we're happy to throw them in the package as well. But that did not exist as a part of English literature before Tolkien basically had this spring from his mind. And then the implications of that, of course, are this huge multi-billion dollar industry probably. And all I want to say about that is, born of a deeply Christian vision, someone has come up with a very durable, profound, much imitated, and highly valued cultural good that has helped contribute to human well-being, enjoyment, pleasure, and all those other things all across the world. Born of a deeply Christian vision for the order of things. Free market economics. I don't want to talk too much about all these, so let me just talk about the next one. Separation of church and state. This is a really interesting thing. When people talk about separation of church and state in modern evangelical circles, a lot of times we complain about this as a kind of this evil doctrine that the Supreme Court came up with, and the First Amendment doesn't separate, doesn't have this wall of separation. And they will often give Thomas Jefferson as a source of the wall, this doctrine of the wall of separation between church and state. You know where that phrase actually came from? It was not from Thomas Jefferson and not from his letter to the Danbury Baptists. It's a phrase that Roger Williams used. And he said, if we do not erect and maintain a wall between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the state wilderness of state will encroach on and destroy the garden of the church. So we need to keep that wall of separation. And you know what he's saying there? Notice the distinctively Christian vision and motivation. He's saying the most important thing is the purity of the church. And if we're going to maintain the purity of church, we need to create a wall of separation between that and the corrupting influence of the state. Now, if you were to fast forward to the year 2011 and go to Europe and talk to evangelical Christians there about the church in Europe compared to the church in America, you know what they'll say about the church in America compared to the church in Europe? Almost universally, the church in America is much, much stronger. And if you ask them why, they will almost always give the same answer. Because you have a separation of church and state. And your churches have always had to depend on themselves and on their Lord for their sustenance, and not on the taxes and the largesse of the government. And it's ended up building a much healthier church because the church has had to stand on its own before Jesus. And the bottom line is, the separation of church and state has proven to be a very enduring cultural good, born again of a clear Christian conviction and imagination, in this case on the part of Roger Williams. So the thing that I'm trying to tease out here is a mindset among many influential people, influential Christians, that have contributed to things that have actually shaped human culture as you and I know it today. Very big, very significant, broad cultural goods born of a deeply Christian vision of what the world should be like. And that is what I'm trying to argue for our vision for the integration of faith and learning. That this is a thing that looks out into culture as we have created it, or the world as God has created it, and culture as human beings have worked on it, and says, God has a vision for this. And our job as Christians is to help see that vision implemented in the time and place that He has put us there. So we will be producing goods not only that refer to the context of Christian worship and life, but also broader cultural goods that will influence the world in which we live. Now, Christians have different visions of how to do that, and we will talk about that probably later in class. But the big picture of saying we are participants in culture. We are fully human. And we need to live in this world as human beings, even though we are on a mission to the next world. That's part of the vision that shapes this. So let me pause there because I'm about to talk about the biblical and theological foundations. Any questions or comments on what I've just talked about to this point? This is a senior capstone seminar. This is where you are thinking about things you've thought about before. And this is a great place to verbalize some of those things because you tend to remember what you say, not what I say. So speak to me. What are some of the things that this may trigger in your own thinking? Or questions? Yeah.
What are you going to say about free market economies?
Briefly. The root of free market economy in many ways really does attach to a Christian vision of two or three things about the world. One of them is the value of human freedom. And if you read like Max Weber and Protestant Work Ethic, you'll see a lot of the development of capitalism that springs out of notions of vocation that are deeply Christian. So if we do a section actually on a theology of work, we'll talk about a set of things that actually really do kind of baptize a spiritual significance to ordinary human work, which is very essential in developing that current of modern American capitalism, of modern Western capitalism. Now, the reason I'm kind of ambivalent, I'm actually very happy to talk about this, it's a hard thing for me to talk about briefly, because I have deep concerns about unbridled and unlimited and unbounded free markets. I feel like sometimes when people talk about free markets, they talk about it as if there was no fall. And whenever you start doing things like that, I get really nervous because every time I turn around, I feel like there was a fall. So yeah, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk some about that later in class. That would also be a thing, globalization. Well, two or three economic issues that I actually have some projects for another class that if you're interested in doing that for this class, we could talk a little bit about that and I could give you some quick guidelines for doing some of that, which might be really interesting if you have an interest in that area. Other questions or comments on this? Okay, if not, let me take the next 20 or 25 minutes and give kind of a biblical anchoring of some of the things that I have just said. If I'm really going to make the claim that the Christian faith has implications for all these other things that don't seem very Christian, like free markets, like government, like the environment, or all these things, where in the world and why in the world can I make that claim? Where do I anchor that in Scripture and theology to say that the Christian faith should really be entailing all these sorts of things? Now, there's a lot of places that I could do this, but the place that I will do it from is from Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. And I get the impression that, how many of you guys were in chapel when Darian Lockett spoke yesterday or sometime? I think he picked up some of this, so hopefully this might be actually repeating some of the things he said. He's a guy who teaches integration seminars as well, and so we've talked about that. He quoted me. Well, that's got to make it good, right? So let me talk about Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. I cleverly left my Bible at home, actually. Wow. Please don't report me. I feel really guilty as a Bible professor who comes to class without a Bible. These are the things that we mock people for, right? And here I am doing it. Colossians chapter 1 is an interesting chapter. One of the controversies that's going on in Colossians is exactly who the person of Christ is. And there seems to be what some people call kind of a proto-Gnostic heresy. We'll probably talk about the Gnostic side of it in a little bit later. But it kind of doubts Christ, it kind of spiritualizes Christ and doubts his connection to some of the rest of the world. Now, that is looming in the background. Gnosticism itself didn't really come up until later. So this would be kind of the seeds of that sort of thought, maybe a little more Neoplatonistic than fully Gnostic sort of thought. But that's looming out there. There's also kind of a Jewish heresy that is rolling around there that goes back to valuing Sabbath days and things like that in diet rules. And so in Colossians 2, you find some of that talked about. So there's this kind of background of heresy going on in Colossians. And right at the beginning of Colossians in chapter 1, as Paul introduces the body of his letter, he kind of just does one of those straight-in-your-face shots that lays the foundation, that pushes back against all of the heretical things that are rattling around in the background there of Colossians. And so he talks about Christ as we've been transported from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his glorious Son. And then he talks about who this Son is and says he's the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things are made, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were made through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he's the head of his body, the church, that in all things he might be preeminent. For in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things through his blood shed on the cross. Roughly speaking, that last part I think I got a little shaky on, but that's the essence of that passage. And what I want to do is stop and think about that description of Jesus and what that entails for the issue of the integration of faith and learning, because it teaches you some really important things about who Jesus is. And notice he does two big obvious things here. One is he makes really big statements about Jesus, but the other thing is he makes a huge bunch of statements about all things, everything, all of these sorts of things. 7 or 8 times in this passage he uses this phrase all or every, referring to the entire cosmos, just plain everything. So I want to unpack this relationship in a little bit more systematic fashion. So first he says Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He uses the phrase that in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. So that's partly from 15, partly I think verse 19 uses that phrase. And in this we get a very clear statement of the doctrine of the incarnation. The fullness of God is dwelling in this person, Jesus. God has entered human flesh. And this will introduce you to basically the person of the king, Jesus. And I'm using this king phrase because at the end of the day I'm going to kind of call this kingdom integration. So this will all attach to Jesus as king. You don't have to worry too much about that, but understand that is how Paul set it up in verses 13 and 14. He's talking about this kingdom transfer. So here we meet the king of this kingdom into which we've been transferred. Second thing that you bump into is the statement that all things were made by him, for him, through him, fill in the blank with your favorite preposition. If it's in the world, it's that for him. And here we get the doctrine of creation. Obviously, if we had the incarnation there, we have the creation here. He is the one by whom all things are made, and for and through. And this obviously is the realm of the king. This is, if the person of the king is in the first part of the picture, the realm, this is where Jesus lives, so to speak. This is his turf. He is the creator of all this realm. Now, why is that issue so important? And this is kind of, we'll fast forward quickly to a little bit of where this vision goes. I just want you to think about the nature of ownership conceptually for a minute. How do you become, well, first let me ask the question, what owning means, and then I want to ask the question, how do you become an owner? So let me tell you just a little story as a mental picture of ownership. You are a Biola student, and then you get your Biola bill. And you suddenly worry that you'll no longer be a Biola student because the Biola bill is so big. So you go, what am I going to do now? Mom and Dad and me, we saved up $8,000. I got to drum up 12. What am I going to do? You run out and you look for a job, and you're driving around La Mirada and you see Mr. Tang's Chinese restaurant. There's a little sign there, help wanted. And you say, hey, I'll do Chinese, no problem. So you walk in, there's Mr. Tang. He says, yes, I need some help. You willing to do it? And I said, I'm in. You point me in the right direction and I'll go do it. So you're motivated, right? You're going to drop out of school if you don't get enough money. So you're showing up all the time. Mr. Tang's like, hey, this guy's all right, And so you start out as busboy, then you're, washing dishes. Then the next thing you know, he's letting you cook in the back. And after about 4 or 5 months, he's like, wow, this guy's good. I'm going to give him a raise and make him a manager. So 3 more months, you're working there for Mr. Tang, and he's finally like, man, you're running this ship great. I'm going to go back to Hong Kong. I haven't visited my family in like 9 years. So I'll leave you here. We'll be back in 2 months, and have a good time. Here's my cell phone if you need to catch me. So off he goes to Hong Kong, and you're sitting here managing Mr. Tang's Chinese restaurant. And the only problem is you're Mexican. And after a while, you're like, I am so sick of sweet and sour fill in the blank. I have rolled my last mushu pork. I've just had it right up to here. So I'm going to whip out a few chimichangas. I mean, this is Southern California, isn't it? So you go and whip up a few chimichangas, slide them on the menu there, and next thing you know, hey, you got some people coming, hey, I like chimichangas. Have some chimichangas and some sweet and sour chicken. This is great. So you keep going, and next thing you know, you break out the burritos, some tamales, and this whole thing's going great. And you got this whole clientele going, and the next thing you know, the door opens, and there's Mr. Tang. And you're holding a plate full of burritos and tamales. And he looks at you, and he looks at the plate, and he goes, what's that? And you go, well, those are burritos and those are tamales. They go really good with both red and green sauce. You'll love them. He goes, no, I won't love them. That's Mexican food. He says, yeah, but people love Mexican food. I love Mexican food. You'll love Mexican food. Try it. You'll like it. He's like, I don't think you understand. Come out here. And he puts his arm around you and he points at the sign and it says, read that sign. What does it say? Mr. Tang's Chinese restaurant. Right, what's that? Mexican food. You don't serve Mexican food in a Chinese restaurant. Oh, but people love it. And I only want to know one question. Who's going to win the argument? You or Mr. Tang? Why? Because he's the owner. And the owner gets to decide what to do with it. And here's the question. Who's the owner of the universe? How do you establish ownership? This is an interesting thing to think about. How do you become the owner of something? Normal Americans. Buy it. Good thing. How else can you become owner? Somebody can give it to you. How else can you become owner? You can make it. How else can you become owner? You can inherit it. Hey, anybody ever do the stupid thing that we did once and feed the neighborhood cat? It suddenly becomes your cat, whether you like cats or not. And suddenly, because you're the one who sustains it, you become the owner of it. And notice the picture painted of Jesus in Colossians chapter 1. He buys it with his blood shed on the cross. He created it. He got there first. He is the before all things. He's also the firstborn, which does not mean chronological. It's an inheritance term. He is the one who inherits the world. He buys it, owns it, and the world holds together in him. Everything you could possibly do to imagine and establish ownership, guess what? Jesus has done that relative to the created order. And you know what that means? He's Mr. Tang. And if somebody asks you, who's Jesus to tell me what to do with my body? You know what the answer is? He's your owner. And you're the steward of the gift of life. And when the time comes for the body to be broken and the pot at the wheel and all those kinds of things, and the body goes back to the dust and the spirit of life returns back to God who gave it, because it was always his. He's the one who gets to decide what to do with a human body, what to do with a human culture, what to do with a human world. Why? Because he is the rightful owner 5 times over. If anybody here happens, any philosophy majors? Really fun to do this with Aristotle's 4 causes. Material cause, formal cause, instrumental cause, final cause, exact list of those things represented in Colossians chapter 1. Jesus is the root cause, telos, purpose, and the thing that holds together the entire created order. He's the why. He's the owner. He's the direction. And so integration is simply seeing things the way they really are meant to be, which is in light of their ownership by Jesus Christ. Okay? Third thing here, he is the head of a church, his body, the firstborn from the dead. He reconciled all things to himself, whether things in heaven or on earth, making peace by his blood on the cross. And here you get the doctrine of redemption, which is the mission of the king. The redemption is this process of restoring all things to their rightful place. The fulfilling of the vision that was instantiated at creation, corrupted in the fall, is in the process of being restored now, and we look forward to a future consummation when all things will be made new. And the only thing I want to say right now about redemption, there's a million things you can say about redemption, but the thing I want you to remember is this phrase, all things. Because we have a nasty habit of preaching as if what the Bible teaches is Jesus redeems all souls for himself. Or he reconciles all spirits to himself. And you know what the Christian doctrine is on this matter? Is not that Jesus came to save souls, but to save whole persons. Because when you come to Christ, you don't just have a future for your spirit. What happens to your body when you die? What do you get? I can't hear you. A new one. Do you get a new one? You get a better than restored. You get a resurrection body. Your lowly body is changed to be like his heavenly body that will never destroy or rot or decay. And you know what? That heavenly body is a foretaste not only of our future in a body, but almost the exact same thing happens with planet Earth. We have an old Earth that is groaning and longing for what? For redemption, for the revealing of the sons of God. And what happens to an old Earth when Jesus comes back? We get a new earth, right? And the Christian vision for the future is not a vision of floating around in heaven with a harp sitting on a cloud, which I'd really like to know how that works. I mean, by the time you put the harp on the cloud, you fall through, right? I don't get that. But the bottom line is, I don't have to worry about that because that is not the Christian vision. The Christian vision is not of eternal life floating as spirits, disembodied spirits in heaven, but in eternal life with God in a new heaven and a new earth that is modeled after the pattern of a human city with a garden in the midst. And fascinating combination of the great artifact of human culture, city building, and the great direct product of God's hand, garden making, united together in a flourishing final new heaven, new earth vision. So we don't worship a God whose vision of redemption is confined to spiritual things. We see the entailment of redemption as being far, far beyond merely spiritual issues. It certainly includes those issues, but it's absolutely transformative to the whole cosmos. And that's why I call this class Jesus Lord of All. Because I'm worried we think all and we think small, and that's almost a crime. We need to think big and comprehensive when we think of the mission, the purpose, the vision of Jesus Christ. So that's the mission of redemption. Nice way to think about this. In Scripture, you see this picture of the missionary sending God, the Father who sends God the Son, and the Father and the Son who send the Spirit, and the Father, Son, and Spirit who send the church on a mission of the redemption of all things. And that's what the entire cosmos, Trinitarian God expressed in a created cosmos is all about, is this kind of a mission of redemption and restoration. Okay, let me say three quick things about Colossians 1, kind of by way of ultimate conclusion to wrap up the time today. Number one, the God of creation is the God of redemption, is the incarnate Christ our King. This would be a very clear teaching of Colossians 1. The God of creation, remember we met him, he was my second point, simply is the God of redemption. That was the third point, who is the incarnate Christ our King. That was the first point of the three doctrinal elements I drew out of Colossians 1 there. The incarnate God, the creator God, and the redeemer God. And this sentence combines all three of those together. The God of creation is the God of redemption, is the incarnate Christ our King. Now, why do I care so much about that? I mentioned briefly before the issue of Gnosticism and kind of the shadowy background connection it has to some of the controversy of Colossians chapter 1. Let me explain. I'm assuming you've heard of the phrase Gnosticism, right? Or the term? Okay. Let me explain just really quickly what that means and then why this statement is so important relative to Gnosticism. What Gnosticism does is it values, in effect, spiritual knowledge kinds of things. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge, and that's where we get the word Gnosticism from. And it says the way that you get enlightenment is through special knowledge. The reason you need enlightenment, your sin, your problem, is that in effect, the spark of the divine has been trapped in material creation. The material world was created by an evil God, an anti-God, and it has captured these kind of sparks of the true divine and embedded it in kind of a prison house of flesh sort of thing. And that's our problem. And the thing we want to do is be liberated from this evil matter. Now, let me just make an interesting point about that. When you read Gnostic writing, you will quickly discover a huge difference between the God of Genesis 1 and the God of John 1. The Logos, Greek word for reason or word, sounds really nice to a Gnostic, right? And so John 1, you have the word, and you see all that. They do get nervous about the word becoming flesh, but they like the word at the beginning. Genesis 1, what do you have? You have a God who says, let there be light, and there was light, and then he makes a material world. And you know what you find out? The God of Genesis 1 is a creator God, and he is a Satan figure in Gnosticism. Jehovah God, Elohim, the creator God of Genesis 1, is a Satan figure in Gnosticism. He is not a good God, he is an evil God. Why? Because he makes a material world. Material things are evil. So what Gnosticism does is it splits apart the God who made the world from the God who redeems the world. And what Paul does in opposition to Gnosticism is something very simple. He does not offer an argument against Gnosticism, he offers a person. Because he says the God of creation is the God of redemption, is the single incarnate Christ, our King. That's how he refutes Gnosticism, by pointing to Jesus and says, Jesus, creator of the material world and also the redeemer of every spirit and every act of any spirit that you'll ever find anywhere. That's Jesus. So the God of creation is the God of redemption, is the incarnate Christ, our King. Second and related point, Christ is the immediate king over all of the created order. Let me explain what I mean by that. When I say the immediate king, that doesn't mean he got there really, really quickly. What I'm trying to say is he is the king without need of mediator over the created order. In other words, he could rule the created order directly. He belongs in a material world because he has a material body, right? Christ became incarnate at his advent. He died and was buried, crucified, died, and was buried, and then he was resurrected. What did he pick up when he was resurrected? What do you get when you get resurrected? A resurrection body. Very good. So Jesus gets a body. How long does he keep that body? Do you mean Jesus still has a body? Ha! You're right, he does. And guess what? If he has a body like that, he belongs in a world full of bodies, right? And we have this weird way of thinking about the resurrection body. It's kind of airy-fairy and maybe not quite working right. And I admit, it's a little funky in the sense that it's like he can eat a fish and then he walks through a wall. And you wonder, so like did the fish get stuck on the outside as he passed through? How does that whole thing work? It's confusing. But whatever the deal is, you think your body is really like good stuff? I hate to break it to you, but it is so totally going to pot, it's ridiculous. Your body, well, your bodies may still be getting better. Trust me about bodies, that's going to end soon. It is going to pot, and it's going to pot quick. If you want to find a body that's really durable, lasting, and substantive and won't be harmed by nuclear war, look for a resurrection body. That's the real body. And look for a new world, because this world is winding down. Look for a new body in a new world. God has a vision for a future. And so it's kind of a weird thing when we have to always kind of spiritualize things to get Jesus stuck in, because it seems to make us think like Jesus doesn't have like the body part, he only has the spirit part. And so you end up sticking Jesus into a picture kind of like a parent at a junior high dance. Ever seen a parent at a junior? I've been a parent at a junior high dance. Really bad way to spend the night. All the junior hires are looking at you like, what in the world are you doing here? And you're looking at yourself the same way. What am I doing here? Can I leave now? You feel so out of place. And have you ever seen people kind of presencing Jesus in a way like he doesn't belong there? It's just kind of like weird. Let me show you a picture of this. This is a picture. I'll go ahead and turn out the other light. This is by a guy named David Casper Friedrich. Painting of a nice mountain setting. I grew up in Colorado. I did a lot of backpacking. I have climbed up 100 mountain creeks that look just like this. I'll tell you, the same thing happens when you get to the top of every mountain creek with a river flowing out. You find the same thing at the top. And it's not actually a glowing cross. It is a lake. Now, those of you from Southern California are unfamiliar with lakes, but in other parts of the world, they're bodies of water, out of which rivers flow. And so I'm looking at this thing and saying, okay, I get the river, I get the canyon, the glowing cross is just kind of like, well, what's that doing there? And then for good measure, in case you missed it, up top we have like the echo glowing cross up in the sky. And I'm kind of like, wow, was there no like Jesus presence there? Did we have to drop him in on a glowing cross to get him in the picture? Or if that is enough, we could do the full-blown Gothic cathedral where the lake is supposed to be. And I look at this stuff and it's like, I don't actually mind the picture per se, and I am indeed using this for an illustration, but I do worry a little bit that we kind of have this slap the bumper sticker on it, man, instead of how to get Jesus in there. And it almost paints a picture of a Jesus who never sweat, never ate, never burped, never got tired, and never fell asleep. And that isn't the picture of the Jesus we have in the Gospels. And we have a picture of future Jesus who's kind of disembodied and glowing in the sky. And I'm going, I don't think that's actually the biblical vision. And we need to see Jesus just a little bit more clearly so we can see him as belonging in the world in which we actually live. Finally, Christ is the only and ultimate redeemer of all that will be redeemed. And I think I said enough about the universal aspect of God's redemption at the close of my original comments on Colossians 1 that I won't say anything more about it here. And let me just give this final statement then of Colossians 1 as kind of a central definition of what integration is really all about. The task of theological integration is to enthrone Christ as King in every sphere of human endeavor and every aspect of the created order. Because we claim that all things were made not only by him, but for him. That is really the great, what I call the war of the prepositions. That is the entire story of all of human history, the war of the prepositions, because there's only one question being asked and answered in all of history, and that is this: is everything that was made by Jesus going to be used for Jesus? That's the only question that matters. Satan says no, Jesus says yes, and you have to choose sides. And if you choose Jesus' side, then here's your mission. To as much as you can, try to see to it that, I say enthrone Christ as King, guess what? He's already King. So he doesn't so much need to enthrone him as that enthronement needs to be recognized. In every sphere of human endeavor, whatever Jesus puts you in charge of, you manage in a way such that it honors Jesus for his original intended purposes for it. Every aspect of the created order over which you have control. I own 2/3 of an acre of planet Earth. I answer for that part of the created order to Jesus. I answer for my children, for my family. These are things for which I give an account, and I have to stop and ask, how would Jesus have this land managed, this family led? Those are the concerns I have. And so when I'm trying to integrate, so to speak, all I'm really trying to do is restore everything back to its rightful relationship in Jesus' word direction. That all things were made by him will ultimately be used for him. That's the vision of theological integration.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.